James was confident that his marriage to Claire was perfect, but everything changed when she started coming home with smudged lipstick, torn stockings, and a mysterious smile. She began disappearing more frequently for late-night parties, and then a young man appeared, a guest in their home. James noticed signs of betrayal, but Claire insisted everything was fine. However, her behavior grew more provocative, and her talk of a new life made James question everything. What is Claire hiding, and has someone else really entered her life? The ultimatum she presents changes everything. How will James handle a truth that is almost fully revealed? An unfaithful wife invited her young lover and made a shocking ultimatum. This will turn your perception of infidelity upside down. James set his tablet down on the table, staring at the blank screen. Lately, he felt as though he'd been blindsided by his own life. Everything seemed fine. He had a stable job, good friends, and, seemingly, a wonderful wife, Claire. But something had changed. She had become less open, sometimes cold, and the warmth that once radiated from her gaze seemed to vanish. They often sat together at dinner, but could barely sustain a conversation for more than a few minutes. She seemed content reading her favorite magazines, scrolling through social media, while he, despite his fatigue after work, couldn't focus on anything except the constant thoughts of what was happening between them. Maybe it's just how things are. Maybe it's just a phase in a relationship, James thought. But when the sound of her laughter disappeared from the house, when they no longer spent evenings together as they once had, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, after Claire returned home from work, James noticed her gaze was focused on something unknown. She frequently looked at her phone, even when he tried to start a conversation. "What's new at work?" he asked, trying to remain open. Claire smiled, but her reply was indifferent. "Nothing special, just the usual." Her answer was so detached that James couldn't help but notice how her attention returned to her phone. She often glanced at the screen, but he couldn't tell who she was communicating with. These small moments began to weigh on James. He couldn't understand why they had grown so distant, or what was happening with Claire. He knew she was changing, but he couldn't pinpoint what was causing it. One day, after several instances where she ignored his questions or declined to spend time together, James decided to take action. He began paying attention to details: when she left for work, where she went after finishing her errands. With each observation, he started noticing more mysterious changes in her behavior, though nothing concrete enough to confirm his suspicions. One evening, when he came home after a day at work, he noticed a call on her phone. It was an unfamiliar number. James recalled how she had mentioned a man she worked with and how much she smiled when she talked about him. A theory began forming in James's mind. Was there something more than innocent conversations here? He knew it could just be paranoia, but he couldn't stop these thoughts. He needed to know the truth. But Claire seemed to sense his suspicions. One evening, she returned home with an unmistakably different atmosphere. Something was off, but she didn't say a word. It felt like a new level of detachment, a tension James couldn't explain. "Did something happen?" he asked when she silently sat on the couch, avoiding his gaze. "No, everything's fine," she replied, but her voice was slightly hollow, her eyes averted. James tried to talk to her about it several times, but each time, she found an excuse to change the subject. He could no longer ignore the barrier between them. They were growing increasingly distant, and it was undeniable. Yet James decided to be patient. Maybe she was just going through something at work. But the tension persisted. And then, one evening, while he was sitting on the couch finishing a book, Claire suddenly lifted her head. "I need to talk to you," she said seriously, looking at him with an expression that made James feel this wasn't just a casual conversation. Her voice carried a mix of nervousness and resolve, like someone who had made a decision long ago. James felt his heart begin to race. "What's wrong?" he asked, though he already suspected this would be something big. But Claire didn't respond. She only smiled faintly, her face shadowed with doubt. She decided not to speak further and walked into another room. This struck James as deeply strange. The next day, James sat in his study, working on yet another computer repair when Claire entered, lightly sitting on the chair beside him. He noticed the look of anxiety on her face, but it had become such a familiar expression that he wasn't even surprised. For several days, She hadn't been her usual self, more withdrawn and distracted. James rarely asked her personal questions, but today he felt it was time. "You look like something's bothering you, Claire," he began, turning off his computer and sitting across from her. "What's going on? I've noticed you've been lost in your thoughts a lot lately." She lowered her gaze as if she couldn't find the words to respond. Then, taking a deep breath, she raised her eyes to him again. "I need to talk to you, James. This isn't just something fleeting. It's important." Her voice was serious, and James immediately felt that something was about to happen. Something that would change his understanding of the situation. Claire had always been open with him, but this time, there was something different, something bigger. "I'm listening," James replied, feeling his heart pick up speed. "There's a guy at work, Martin. He's fallen for me. At first, it was harmless. He was just flirting, but then it turned into something more. One time, he even kissed me." Claire paused as if trying to find the right words to explain everything that had happened. "What?" James stood up abruptly. "How could this happen? How could you let this happen? You must have realized this isn't what we want in our relationship." "I can take care of her," he thought, trying to reassure himself. "She doesn't have to worry about money or work. I can handle it." But even as he tried to convince himself that everything would be fine, the feeling of anxiety wouldn't leave him. Claire was changing, and James could see it. She spent more time at home but was often on her phone. At first, he thought it was just a habit, but then he noticed she was practically glued to the screen. James started to worry. One evening, when he walked into the kitchen, he saw Claire sitting at the table, glancing at her phone, her face reflecting a kind of focus as if she were engrossed in something important. James decided it was time to talk to her because his doubts had become stronger. "Claire, why are you spending so much time on your phone?" James asked, sitting down beside her. "What's going on there?" Claire looked up and smiled involuntarily. She couldn't understand why James had suddenly become so interested in her phone. She set it aside and replied, "I'm just trying to find new opportunities for myself. I've been curious about what young people are into these days, what's trending. I want to figure out how I can earn more and feel young again." She showed him her phone, where an open dating app, Tinder, was displayed. James stared at it in disbelief. "What's this?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. "You're not planning to look for someone new, are you?" Claire laughed, but there was a hint of nervousness in her laugh. "No, of course not. I'm chatting with both guys and girls. I'm just curious about what's popular now, how they think, what they like. And, who knows, maybe I'll find some great startup or business idea. Not everything is so serious. I'm not trying to find someone else." James felt uneasy. It seemed strange that Claire, instead of spending more time with him, was finding solace in such things. His worries began to feel more and more real. "You're already the best, Claire. You're wonderful," James said, trying to support her, though his words came out softer than usual. "You don't need to look for anything else. And, really, you don't need to worry about work. I can support you." Claire smiled, but it seemed like the smile was more for him than for herself. She glanced back at her phone and returned to her thoughts. James realized that she wasn't entirely focused on their relationship, that these new interactions, even if they were through a dating app, had become important to her. "All right," he replied, trying to remain calm. "Just remember, I'm here, and I'm always ready to support you. But maybe don't get too wrapped up in it." Claire nodded, smiling again. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. She was no longer as open and transparent as before. And although she claimed she just wanted to find a new job or activity, he felt her behavior didn't fully align with her words. Over the next few days, James tried not to dwell on it, but his doubts continued to grow. Why had she changed so much? Why had these new interactions become so important to her? And could it all somehow be connected to Martin's attempts to court her? James decided not to jump to conclusions. He wanted to give her space to figure out her desires and plans. But his heart told him that another hard truth might soon surface. Claire had always been special to James, and their marriage initially seemed perfect. They had their cozy little family, and their relationship was built on trust. But lately, he had noticed changes. Claire had changed, and these changes were becoming more apparent. With each passing day, she became more reserved, and her behavior more enigmatic. Evenings when James came home from work, and she was there now, felt different. Recently, Claire had quit her job, and it seemed great. More time for herself, more opportunities for growth. But the more James observed, the more certain details began to worry him. One evening, Claire came out of the bathroom, and James couldn't help but notice how she looked. She was wearing a leather miniskirt, black stockings, and a seductive jacket that seemed to accentuate her beautiful figure even more. She had styled her hair, applied chic makeup, and her lips were painted a striking red. James looked at her, not knowing how to react, and asked, "Claire, why are you dressed like that? Are you going somewhere?" His voice sounded a little surprised, but he tried not to reveal his emotions. Claire smiled, paying no attention to his surprise. "Yes, I've been invited to a party. It's with my new friends from Tinder. I want to have some fun, don't worry." "A party?" James couldn't hide his surprise. He began to wonder why she was dressed like that. Anxiety started to build within him. "And why are you dressed like this? You look like you're 18, he tried to joke, but his voice carried a note of worry. Claire looked at him, her smile growing wider. "You understand, don't you? This is how everyone dresses now. I just want to be part of the youth, not stand out." Without further explanation, she left the room, leaving James standing there, trying to comprehend what was happening. He didn't know how to react. At first, it seemed like just another of Claire's desires to feel young and free, but why did it look so strange? James decided not to argue. He let her go, though his heart told him this wasn't as simple as she made it seem. Left at home, James felt growing anxiety that wouldn't let go even after Claire had left. He decided to check her laptop. Before approaching it, he hesitated, wondering if he should. But curiosity won. He began going through her messages. At first, the screen showed ordinary conversations with friends, with nothing suspicious. But the more he read, the more strange the messages became. Among the chats, there was a lot of communication with young people, both boys and girls, aged 18 to 20. James even found several photos that Claire had sent to the guys. These guys clearly admired Claire very much. But what he found next surprised him even more. A conversation with one of her new friends caught his attention. They were discussing guys she liked. However, when Claire wrote, "I want to feel young again," James paused. It seemed very strange. Why would she phrase it that way when talking about young men? This wasn't just about wanting to be part of a younger crowd. It was something more. James felt his heart start to race. What was she really feeling? Why was she seeking out this kind of interaction? He placed the laptop back where it belonged and sat down on the couch. His mind was still struggling to grasp what exactly was happening in her life. But one thing was clear. Something wasn't right. Claire was no longer the woman he once knew. And though she assured him everything was fine, her behavior raised more questions than answers. James decided to wait until she came home. He couldn't stop thinking about what she was doing and who she was spending time with. Was it just a desire to feel young again? Or were there much bigger changes happening in her life that he didn't know about? Claire came home late at night, and her behavior was even more puzzling than before. She seemed slightly changed, tired but at the same time happy. However, her lipstick was slightly smudged, which struck him as odd, and there was a tear in her stockings near the knee. James didn't ask about her evening because he knew the answers he'd get might only lead to more questions. He decided to keep calm, though he felt that the mystery Claire was hiding was only beginning to unravel. The next morning, Claire woke up as if nothing had happened. She looked fresh and rested, and even smiled brightly as she walked into the living room where James was already drinking his coffee. "Good morning," she said, sitting down at the table. James looked at her but didn't respond immediately. It was hard for him to understand what was happening. He was still reflecting on what had happened the previous night and how his wife had spent her time at the party. But now, seeing her behave as if nothing serious had happened, he was conflicted. "How are you?" Claire asked, starting a casual conversation, seemingly unaware that James was more worried than he wanted to let on. "Everything's fine," James replied, trying to hide his suspicions. He didn't want to bring up her nighttime adventures just yet, but the thoughts wouldn't leave him. Claire began telling him how much fun she'd had the night before, saying, "It was amazing. I met some wonderful guys and girls, and we had a great time. Her eyes sparkled, and her enthusiasm seemed genuine, though James couldn't shake a strange feeling. For the first time in a long while, I felt young again, Claire added, watching James. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. Why don't you feel that way with me? James asked, somewhat bewildered. Claire smiled and looked at him as if he were a child who didn't understand. It's not that I don't. It's just, when I was younger, I worked so much, and there was no time for fun. But now I want to relax. And besides, you agree, don't you, that it's normal to try new things and explore new paths? Yes, that's pretty cool, James agreed, though he didn't understand why she kept talking about new opportunities and experiences. He realized Claire wanted to change something in her life, but something about it bothered him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this change than she was letting on. Nonetheless, Claire continued talking about how she'd learned about online careers that were very popular right now, and that this could be a good opportunity for her. It's all so interesting, James. I want to be part of this new culture. I want to find out what's going on in the world, she said. James nodded. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but a suspicious voice inside him urged him to pay more attention to Claire. Still, he decided to keep quiet. Suddenly, Claire walked over to him and kissed him, smiling. You're my hero, she said, and James felt his heart calm down a little. He loved her, and though he didn't understand her behavior, he believed everything would be okay. Are you planning to invite someone over? James suddenly asked, realizing she might already be thinking about meeting her new acquaintances. Well, I was thinking we could invite a few young people over, so you could meet them too. I think it'd be good for you, she continued. James agreed, though a little warily. Sure, we can, he said, trying to stay open-minded while noting that her desire to connect with such a young crowd felt a bit puzzling. The next day, everything was ready for the guests. Claire looked stunning. She wore an elegant dress, and her makeup highlighted her beauty. 2 young men and 2 young women she had invited arrived on time. James was struck by their youth, energy, and engaging conversations. They talked about technology, startups, and world events, and James even joined the conversation a few times. But as time went on, he began to notice Claire behaving strangely. She smiled more and flirted with the guys, touching them, and her jokes with them became more suggestive. She couldn't hold back and started hugging them, and James, though he tried not to show it, felt a strange unease. He felt uncomfortable. He knew it was jealousy, but he didn't want to come across as overbearing or dramatic. Still, his anxiety continued to grow. At the end of the evening, after everyone had left, James sat silently, reflecting on everything that had happened. He tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence, that nothing serious had occurred. But he still felt that something had changed between them and that something was wrong. Claire returned, looking satisfied, but there was a hidden secret in her eyes. Did you have a good time? She asked, looking at James. He nodded, but the questions remained. Why had her behavior changed so much? What was really going on? Was this just the beginning? The next morning, James felt uneasy. The previous evening wouldn't leave his mind. Claire had acted so strangely, as if she were hiding something. He tried not to jump to conclusions, but his heart told him this wasn't just an innocent fascination with new friends. Claire's interest in the younger crowd seemed genuine, but was it really as harmless as it appeared? He couldn't forget their last conversation. How easily she had spoken about new acquaintances and plans, how she said she wanted to be trendy and explore new professions. But why was this so important? Why now? And was there more to it than she let on? These questions lingered as he met Claire in the kitchen. She seemed normal, even cheerful, as she smiled at him. Good morning, James said, trying to appear calm. Good morning, she replied, her voice cheerful. Sorry for the early start, but I need to go to the office today. I have to pick up some important things. What things? James asked, trying not to sound too suspicious, though it was beginning to trouble him. Well, it's related to some documents, but nothing major. I just need to get them from Martin, Claire said, as if it wasn't anything unusual. Martin again. His name had been stuck in James's mind since their previous conversations. Just yesterday, Claire had said she didn't want to return to the office because of Martin and how he had recently made unwanted advances. James couldn't understand why she couldn't just wrap things up and avoid him altogether. Are you sure you want to do this? James couldn't hold back his concerns. If he tries to kiss you again, I'll go after him. You don't want that to happen again. Claire laughed, wiping a tear from her laughter. Don't worry, James. I've already told him it won't happen again. I can handle it. You don't want me to go back to that office only to have it repeat itself, do you? She kissed him goodbye, and again. Her words offered a moment of calm, though he subconsciously felt it wasn't that simple. Be careful, okay? James said, standing at the door. Claire nodded and left. James was left alone. He sat in the living room but couldn't shake thoughts of Claire and Martin. Why did she need to pick up documents from him? And why was she increasingly talking about new opportunities and new acquaintances? Something was off. He lacked the information to fully understand what was really going on. Meanwhile, Claire drove to the office. She was confident James wouldn't follow her. She had long since grown accustomed to the invisible control he tried to impose in their marriage. She had decided for herself that she needed to act. This was her chance. Only now, with everything going according to plan, did she realize she couldn't return to her old life. At the office, when Claire met with Martin, the atmosphere immediately felt tense. They both remembered what had happened before. Martin looked up at her when she entered his office. "Hello, Claire," he said with an unmistakable smile. She noticed his gaze wasn't as innocent as it used to be. "Hello," she replied, standing in the doorway. "I came for the papers we talked about." "Of course," he said, getting up and walking to the desk, opening a drawer. Claire stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with conflicting thoughts. She knew she had to choose now, whether to leave this all behind or move forward. As Martin searched for the documents, Claire glanced around quickly. This was the same office where she had worked before deciding to change her life. But her desire to break free from this world was stronger. "Here you go," Martin said, handing her the documents. "But you know, Claire, you can't just leave like this. Why don't we talk about it again? About what happened between us?" His voice was soft, but there was a hint of something more. Claire felt her heart begin to race. She knew this wasn't right, but part of her still felt drawn to Martin. She hesitated, turning back to him. "I don't think that's a good idea, Martin," she said with a smile, but her voice was cold. "I'm married. You understand that, don't you?" "That doesn't mean we can't be together if you want it," Martin said, stepping closer, gently touching her hand. Claire felt her heart flutter. She knew she had a choice to make, but what would she choose? Only she could decide whether to leave this all behind or move forward. When she left the office, Claire felt torn. She knew James was waiting for her at home, but she also understood that she was ready for a different life, a different future. Returning home, she saw James already waiting. He met her gaze, and she knew things would be different now. "Did you get everything?" James asked, but there was a different tone in his voice. Claire nodded, trying to appear calm. "Yes, everything," she replied, but there was a hidden secret on her face. James didn't know what else was going on, but his suspicions only deepened. He couldn't understand why she had started changing so much, or what exactly she was hiding. Claire added that Martin had once again tried to convince her not to leave the company, which surprised him greatly. Sitting on the couch, beer in hand, his thoughts couldn't leave what he had just heard. "Did he say something to you?" James finally asked, looking at Claire sitting beside him. Claire looked at him, and though her gaze was calm, James noticed a trace of nervousness in her voice. "Yes, he started trying again to talk me into staying with the company. He's so insistent that it's really starting to scare me." Her words shocked James so much that he froze. He tried to piece together his scattered thoughts. What did this mean? Why was Martin so desperate to keep Claire at the company? Was it because he wanted to be with her? Was there something more? This wasn't the first time James had felt there was some mystery to their relationship. James felt he had to do something to understand what was really going on. "If you need to go back there again, I'll go get whatever you need from him. Don't worry about it. I'll talk to him myself and make him understand that it's not your place if that's what it takes," he said, trying to sound confident. James didn't yet know what was happening, but something stirred within his heart. "Thank you, darling," Claire said, hugging him. Her words were warm, but James still had a lingering sense that something wasn't right. Why had she reacted like that to what he said? Was she truly that worried about Martin? Or was there another reason for her unease? She let go of him and, after a short pause, added, "Maybe we should invite some friends over? Relax a little. I could order some great food and drinks. We could use a break after all of this." James wasn't sure if this would really help, but he realized he needed to support Claire. She'd had a tough day, and he didn't want to burden her with additional worries. "All right," he said, though his thoughts kept circling the same questions that had just formed in his mind. Soon, Claire's friends and some of James's friends arrived at their home. They were young men and women who loved to party. The music grew louder, laughter and conversations mixed into a single chaotic atmosphere. James tried to relax, but he felt out of place. This wasn't his kind of setting. He wasn't ready for this, but decided to leave his worries at the door and support his wife. Claire was already the center of attention. She danced with the guys, laughed, and had fun. James stayed seated, drinking his beer and watching. It felt strange to him. He'd always preferred quieter evenings at home without a crowd of guests. But he understood Claire was stressed about work and needed to unwind, so he didn't protest. Suddenly, his gaze stopped on Claire again. She took one of the young men by the hand and started dancing with him. He was a tall, muscular, and handsome young man. He wrapped his arms around her waist, and Claire seemed entirely immersed in the dance. James felt his heart tighten. Even though he understood it was just a dance, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between them. James tried to look away, but his eyes returned to the pair. He felt a wave of jealousy rising within him, though he tried to stay calm. Why does she love spending time with young people so much? He wondered. Why them? Why isn't it just friends but guys who clearly want more? Are you okay? James heard the voice of Paul, one of Claire's friends, who was sitting beside him. Yeah, I'm not used to parties like this, James replied, trying not to show his feelings. Paul smiled. This isn't the first time she's let loose like this. She's always like this. But James wasn't listening anymore. He looked back at Claire, still dancing with the young man. They looked so harmonious on the dance floor that James felt a slight wave of disappointment. He didn't like the situation, but he couldn't tell Claire how he felt. The evening went on, and eventually, the guests began to leave. Claire thanked everyone and started tidying up the room. James quietly watched her, trying to leave everything in order. When they were finally alone at home, James sat on the couch, unsure how to continue the conversation. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Claire sat beside him, stroked his arm, and smiled. "I'm fine, don't worry. It was just a tough day." But James couldn't gather himself. One thought wouldn't leave him alone. How could he be sure Claire was okay? How could he be calm when he had seen how she behaved with the other men? Was it just a small thing, or something more? He felt the answer to this question was just around the corner. "Are you sure you don't want to talk about Martin?" James asked suddenly. Claire looked at him with a hint of surprise, but there was that same nervousness in her gaze that he'd noticed before. "I don't know what you mean," she said, trying to remain calm. "I just think there might be something you're not telling me," James said, not taking his eyes off hers. Claire replied, "I'm not hiding anything from you. There's nothing going on between us. I don't want to talk about it anymore." James believed her and went to rest. The next day, James woke up with the feeling that today was going to be different. Claire looked calm and relaxed, as though everything was fine. Her mood was great, and she even seemed like her old self again. James watched her movements, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he woke, he began to think about everything that had happened the night before, realizing more and more that the party she had attended didn't bode well. Maybe it's just my imagination, he thought, but his heart felt heavy. Claire approached him, smiling, and said, "Tonight, I'm going to a party with friends. It'll be fun. I don't know when I'll be back, maybe late tonight or tomorrow morning." James, though curious, simply nodded. It was hard for him to understand her desire to keep going to such events, especially after her behavior during the last one had struck him as odd. "All right," he said, though there was tension in his voice. He sat and watched as she dressed, choosing a very revealing and provocative outfit. It reminded him of the first time she went to a party. He didn't want to make a scene and decided to ask calmly, "Maybe we skip the party tonight? We could stay home, Just the two of us, he said with a smile. We'll have a great time. You know what I mean? Claire smiled again, but her response was firm. No, James, I really want to go. We'll talk tomorrow. She kissed him on the cheek and left. James stayed home, thinking all the while about what had happened and why he couldn't fully trust his wife. Jealousy and doubt overshadowed any joy he could have felt. Time passed, and Claire didn't come back. James tried not to panic, but the longer she was gone, the more worried he became. He checked the time and his phone repeatedly, but there were no calls or messages from her. Only in the morning, when James woke up, did he realize nothing had changed. Claire still hadn't returned. He was sitting in the kitchen brewing coffee when suddenly the door opened. James turned to see a young man walk into the room. It was the same guy Claire had danced with at their house party. Tall, muscular, and perfectly built, he looked about 18 years old. There were traces of Claire's lipstick on his neck, enough to make James's heart race. Behind him walked Claire, holding his hand. James, meet Christian, she said, as though nothing unusual was happening. He's going to live with us now. I feel young with him, and I know he should be with me. I understand how this looks to you, but if you want me to stay in this marriage, you'll have to accept it. James sat in shock, unable to even approach them. His heart was pounding. He couldn't believe his eyes. The very thing he had feared had happened. It wasn't Martin, as he had suspected. His idea of infidelity, which he thought might have been in his head, had materialized. It was this young man, his youthful rival, with whom Claire had spent the night. What? James finally managed to say. What does this mean? Do you hear me, James? Claire said, stepping closer. This isn't just a fling. I don't want to live in the shadow of your doubts anymore. You bore me. This is a new chapter in my life, and Christian will be here with me. That's my ultimatum to you. I'll live with him here in our home, and you'll support us financially. Do you understand? Or do you want to lose me? James felt his hands drop helplessly. He thought he could resolve everything, figure it all out, but he never imagined his own wife would do this to him. Christian, standing nearby, remained silent, observing James's every move. Claire was calm, even smiling. Yes, I want us to live together, Claire added, unexpectedly presenting James with this shocking ultimatum. Christian and I want to build our future. You have to decide if you want to be part of it or not. James was on the verge of breaking down. He could no longer control his emotions, realizing that everything he had trusted had come crashing down. This was a reality he had never anticipated. Before, he had suspected there might be something more between Claire and Martin, but this was beyond anything he could bear. Are you serious? James finally managed to whisper. Claire nodded. She was ready to end their relationship and give everything up for this newfound freedom. Christian didn't even try to look shy or embarrassed. James's internal struggle was brutal. He wanted to escape this situation, but he didn't know how. So, when Claire and Christian sat together on the couch and began discussing their plans, James simply walked out. He couldn't be part of this false reality, but he needed to understand what had truly happened. At that moment, he didn't yet know that this betrayal was just the beginning of a massive breakdown of his life and his trust in the people he loved. James stood silently, feeling his heart freeze in his chest. His eyes couldn't believe what was happening in front of him. Christian, the young man he had only recently seen dancing at their house party, now stood here, in the room, next to his wife, looking as though this were his rightful place. Christian's neck bore clear traces of lipstick, leaving no doubt. Claire hadn't just danced with him. She had been much more than just an acquaintance. She had been cheating on James with him all along. You're really? James struggled to find the strength to speak. His voice was unsteady, and even he wasn't sure he could say everything that was choking him. Christian, ignoring James's turmoil, smiled and leaned over to Claire, kissing her on the lips. It was a bold, deliberate kiss, full of defiance. Does this surprise you? Christian asked, pulling away from Claire. You saw us dancing. You thought it was just a fun night, but we've been together for weeks now. He looked at James with an expression that suggested this was all perfectly normal. James couldn't believe this was happening. His hands trembled, and he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Just moments ago, everything seemed like an ordinary day, but now his world had been turned upside down. "Claire, why?" he finally managed to say, looking at his wife. "I can't believe this. You couldn't have done this." Claire sat calmly on the couch and looked at James as though nothing terrible had happened. She didn't even seem embarrassed. "James, don't you understand? It's not as simple as you think," she began. "Christian and I have been together for a few weeks now. It just happened, and I don't want to live a lie anymore." James couldn't handle his emotions. He felt his chest tighten, and a lump formed in his throat. It all seemed so unreal. "How could you?" James's voice was filled with pain. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized everything in his life had become meaningless. "We've been together for so many years. I never thought you were capable of this." Noticing James's vulnerability, Christian stepped closer and leaned toward his ear. "Are you going to try and kick us out?" he taunted. "Go ahead. You don't have the strength to face me. You're weak." James felt rage and anger filling his chest, but he couldn't react. The situation was too complex. What he felt was not just anger but deep disappointment. He looked at Claire and realized he could never again trust her the way he once had. "Are you two just playing with my life?" James asked, directing his question to Claire. "I don't understand. Why can't you just leave all this behind? Why did this happen?" Claire slowly stood from the couch and walked toward James. Her eyes showed no remorse, only cold determination. "This isn't just some fling, James. This is real love. Being with Christian makes me feel different. Young, alive, confident. I don't want to be the woman who waits at home while you're at work anymore. I want to feel free." James felt his chest tighten. He looked at Claire, unable to believe what she was saying. She seemed like a completely different person, and all the years of their marriage suddenly felt meaningless. "And now I'm supposed to accept this? To finance your life together?" James asked, barely believing his own words. "You've always supported us, James," Claire said, her tone devoid of emotion. "You've always provided for us. And now, we just want you to keep doing it. Don't see this as betrayal. It's just a new chapter." Christian wrapped his arm around Claire, as if to confirm her words. He looked at James and smiled. "You just have to accept reality, old man. This is how things are now. You need to accept both of us." James felt his mind swirl with anxiety. He couldn't comprehend how this had all happened, how his life, his marriage, and everything he was used to had become so foreign and hostile. I don't know what to do," James said. "This makes no sense." Claire hugged Christian again and, looking at James, said, "You have a choice, James. You can accept us and be part of this new life, or you can leave. The decision is yours." James stood there, feeling his heart shatter. He wanted to say something but couldn't. He could no longer fight for someone who was no longer with him. James sat in his chair, unable to believe what was happening. He felt his heart pounding heavily, the pressure in his chest growing stronger with each passing moment. Claire, his wife, hadn't just betrayed him with Christian, but now a new reality stood before him. She wasn't going to apologize. On the contrary, it seemed like she had already decided this was the right path. And now, she added even more shock. "I'm pregnant, James," Claire said, as if it were the most natural thing to say in such a situation. She didn't look embarrassed or conflicted. Her tone was calm and steady. James felt his head spinning. He tried to understand what she meant. Pregnant? But by whom? Of course, it didn't take him long to realize the child couldn't be his. It all became so obvious and yet so overwhelmingly shocking at the same time. You're pregnant?" James could barely utter the words. He looked at Claire with a bewildered expression, as if hoping she would say it was a joke. But she didn't. "Yes, James, I'm pregnant. And it's not something we can ignore. I can't leave Christian, and you can't kick us out," she added, her expression more calculated than sorrowful. James felt like he couldn't speak. He didn't understand what was happening. His wife was pregnant by a man he couldn't even tolerate. She had been his life, his best friend, and now it was all crumbling before his eyes. He didn't know how to react. How could this have happened? "Wait, are you saying this isn't my child?" The question slipped from his lips, though he already knew the answer. Claire looked at him calmly, as though there were nothing difficult about the situation. She simply nodded. "No, James, it's Christian's child. But that doesn't matter. We're together, and you need to accept that. James couldn't believe it. All these years, all the moments when he worked hard to provide for their future, and now, standing on the brink of this awful reality, he was simply told he no longer mattered. He looked at Claire and Christian, and his heart ached with disappointment. "Can't you just leave me alone?" he asked, struggling to manage his emotions. "Why can't you just say this was all a mistake?" "It's not a mistake, James," Claire said quietly, looking at him. "It's just a new chapter. I don't want to be the woman who waits at home anymore. I want to be with Christian, and I will be. You can either accept it or stay out of our lives." James felt his world collapsing. He sat there, trying to figure out how this had all happened without him knowing. His wife, the woman he loved, was now with someone else, and it was so hard to accept. Christian walked over to him and, as if taunting him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know, James, this is no longer your business," he said calmly. "We're here now, and you have to accept it. Claire and I are having a baby. She's pregnant, and that's not going to change." James couldn't say anything. He sat in silence, his heart shattered. All his hopes, all his efforts, everything he had done for this family now seemed meaningless. How had it come to this? He couldn't find an answer. Weeks passed, and James struggled to come to terms with his emotions. He felt his control over the situation slipping away. He couldn't force Christian and Claire out. They were both in his home, and Claire, pregnant, could no longer return to the life they had before. Even if he wanted to kick them out, he realized it was beyond his power. After several weeks, James received the results of a paternity test. At first, he hadn't wanted to take it because he was convinced the child wasn't his. But eventually, he decided he needed to know the truth. The results left no doubt. The child was his. This revelation shocked James, but at some point, he realized he couldn't just walk away and leave everything behind. He couldn't throw them out of the house or abandon his responsibility for a child that was, in fact, his. Despite the betrayal, he was the father of this child. Now, he stood on the threshold of a new life, unsure of what to do with it all. He had to accept that even if his heart was broken, he still had a responsibility for the new life that would soon come into the world. This was only the beginning of a new chapter, and James didn't know what lay ahead. But he was ready to face it, even if it meant leaving his home and the family it had become. Would you leave your pregnant wife if she cheated on you with an 18-year-old? Share your thoughts in the comments.